Well, hello everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I want to welcome you to the first of 3 watch parties for new learning modules and human rights topics, which are sponsored by the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights and also the Goldstein Center for Human Rights here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I just want to make sure real quick that everyone can hear me okay. Angela, may I ask you if I'm okay on being hearable here? Thank you.
I'm great.
So my name is Laura Alexander, and I serve as Assistant Professor of Religious Studies, as well as the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights here at UNO. Today's module that we're watching is one that I put together on religion and human rights. And then this Wednesday and Friday, you'll also have the opportunity to hear from 2 other UNO faculty who are affiliated with the Goldstein Center. So please come back within a couple of days. This learning module is part of the Goldstein Center's commitment to providing education about human rights by drawing on our faculty members' areas of expertise. We intend that these modules will serve as 10 to 15-minute introductions to topics in human rights. They could be used in a class, for an introduction to a topic at an event or meeting, or just as a way to learn the basics for anyone who's interested. The modules will be hosted on the Goldstein Center's YouTube channel, which I encourage you to subscribe to. Information about that YouTube channel will be in the chat, as well as information about the Goldstein Center website. The website has more information about the center and our activities and events, as well as resources on different human rights subjects, so you should definitely take a look at that as well. I'm going to give a quick thanks to the Creative Production Lab at UNO for assistance with creating and editing this video, and also to Courtney Copeets, Communications Specialist in the College of Arts and Sciences, for all of her work on communicating and marketing these Human Rights Week events. Let me give you a quick rundown of what all we're doing this week, since this is the first event of many for Human Rights Week. Tomorrow, September 22nd, there will be a student-organized panel on pandemic, ecology, and human rights, which features faculty and student speakers. That event will be online, just like this one, and that one runs from 12 to 1 p.m. Like all of these events, you can sign up by going to the Human Rights Week webpage, and we'll put that link in the chat as well. On Wednesday, September 23 at 1 p.m., it's going to be the watch party for the learning module Social Media and Human Rights. On Thursday, September 24th at 7 o'clock p.m. is the Goldstein Lecture on Human Rights, which is sponsored by the Department of Religious Studies at UNO. This is the 22nd annual Goldstein Lecture, and this year the speaker will be Professor Najiba Saeed, who is an interreligious educator and activist. And if I say so myself, she's a really compelling speaker. I'm really excited to get to listen to her speak. On Friday, September 25th is the 3rd watch party, which will showcase a learning module on careers in human rights. And then finally, September 29th at 6:30 p.m., Human Rights Week always gets extended past a week, and this year is no different. So September 29th at 6:30 p.m., a panel of scholars will speak about pandemic and human rights in Latin America, which is part of the Human Rights Forum series and also the Charla series hosted by the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies. So if any of that sounds intriguing, but you didn't quite catch a detail, again, that link to the Human Rights website is in the chat, and you can click on that. One further project the Goldstein Center is also undertaking is in conjunction with UNO TV, and they're producing a new video series titled Human Rights in the Time of COVID-19. In each episode of that series, a Goldstein Center affiliated faculty member will interview an expert on local, national, and international human rights issues. So please keep an eye out for that on the Goldstein Center website and also on NETV. Okay, so let's get to the watch party here. This module is just a bit less than 15 minutes long, and it introduces the topic of religion and human rights. We're going to watch the module together, and then afterwards we'll come back into kind of a chat or a group discussion. And I'm happy to take questions and hold some discussion to clarify or expand on anything that you saw that you might want to know more about. If you could, please put your questions in the chat feature here on Zoom. And feel free to send in those questions at any time. You don't have to wait until the video is finished. Just to let you all know, we are recording this session, so this hour of discussion will be recorded. So Angela Brown, the wonderful project and design manager for the Goldstein Center, is going to be moderating the event. Angela will be sharing the video from her screen for everybody to be able to see. and then she'll moderate the chat and pull questions to ask from there. Angela has done a lot of behind the scenes work in addition to moderating the event today, and I'm very grateful to her for all that she does for the Goldstein Center and the community chair. So Angela, you can go ahead and share the video as soon as you're ready. Everyone else, please indicate in the chat if you have any trouble seeing or hearing the video, and otherwise I hope you enjoy.
Hello everyone, welcome to Religion and Human Rights in 15 minutes or less. This module is coming to you from the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, with special thanks to the Goldstein Center for Human Rights. Now, when you think about religion and you think about human rights, what comes to mind? A lot of people have never thought about those two things together. For a lot of other people, the first thing that comes to mind is conflict. Like, don't religion and human rights kind of not get along? Sometimes we think of religion as being against certain rights for the LGBTQ+ community, or we think of religious teachings that restrict women or treat them as less valuable. But that's actually not always the case, and it's certainly not the whole story. Religion and human rights can actually get along better than you might think. And there's a lot of folks out there who have done both theoretical and practical work to figure out how religion and human rights can enrich each other, and even in some cases cooperate to enhance the well-being of individuals and communities. To start off, I'm going to let you in on a secret. There's no such thing as religion. I know everyone watching this is like, yes, there is. Religion is everywhere. What I mean is that religion is not just one thing. So we can't really talk about the relationship between religion and human rights. We can't even really talk about Hinduism and human rights or Islam and human rights because religious groups aren't single static entities. There's no one thing called Christianity that would think about human rights in a particular way. There are individual Christians, Christian communities, and histories of Christian thought and practice that we can read alongside human rights and see how they interact. Human rights itself is also complicated and arguably has multiple overlapping strands as well. So I want to talk about how we might imagine religion, human rights, and their interaction. How we can recognize their complexity, but also say something about how we engage these things in the real world. Let's start with religion. One way of characterizing religion is that it's an ongoing tradition or even a dialogue among people. You can't escape the influence of religion, whether it's the religion you grew up in, something you came to later, or just the cultural context that surrounds you. But you also have a say in how you relate to religion. You and everyone else bring your own diverse perspectives to practicing religion, and the religion itself can change when it incorporates those diverse perspectives and when it encounters or talks to people from the outside. One quick example is the growing acceptance of women in ministry in some Christian and Jewish communities. Women in churches and synagogues have advocated for change based on historical examples of women leaders, as well as the influence of secular feminism. At the same time, those women preachers and rabbis are becoming part of a long-standing set of institutions, so they're not creating their own tradition out of thin air. What I'm trying to emphasize is that religion embraces both continuity and change. Religious communities have a general set of core beliefs that are quite stable at a fundamental level, but how they interpret and act on those core beliefs can change over time as new ideas come into play. In general, what makes religion different from other kinds of traditions is that religions almost all claim to be about something transcendent. Not about a God necessarily, but something that's outside of everyday human life and experience that has a special kind of authority. Religious communities appeal to this authority to regulate rituals and moral practices, to shape the identities of their members, and to build institutions that help stabilize and guide them over time. But religions still interact with and can be changed by other religions, as well as by philosophical and political movements. For instance, human rights. If we think about it, human rights is an ongoing tradition in the same way. The idea that human beings have rights is embedded in many cultures, and it influences people in ways they can't entirely leave behind. So we might say that human rights represents a set of cultural norms that can also slowly change over time. For example, health has often been thought of as a human right in a sense, but the idea that people have a right to access certain forms of basic health care has become more prominent over the last couple of decades. Like religion, human rights works from a fairly stable set of ideas about what's right and wrong, but it's also open to change over time. And some of those changes might actually come from dialogue with religious ideas. The place where the traditions of religion and human rights most often overlap is in the idea of human dignity. Basically, there's something fundamental about just being human that means we should all be treated well, or at the very least that there are certain horrible things no one should do to a fellow human being, like torture. The writers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 decided that dignity was broad enough to be able to encompass multiple perspectives and keep the support of religious communities who all have their own way of talking about this. So people may disagree on what counts as a human right, but there's still some basic agreement that all people have dignity that should be respected by upholding our rights. That said, people do disagree about rights quite often, in fact. One area where religious practices often conflict with human rights norms is on issues of gender. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that no one should be discriminated against on the basis of gender or sex. But most religions do historically treat men and women differently. Many groups have modified these teachings, so again, we have to look at individual cases to really understand what's going on with a particular religious group. But in addition to our earlier examples of pastors and rabbis, Buddhism traditionally has not allowed women to serve as religious leaders. Judaism historically had laws about divorce that were quite favorable to men and could be really oppressive to women. And many Christian denominations have thought of men as head of the household and have allowed for men to control women, even sometimes to the point of abuse. At the same time, the moral teachings of most religious traditions overlap strongly with many human rights ideas. There are too many examples to name of religious groups upholding rights by providing basic needs for people. They run food banks, educate children in poor and rural areas, build homes, shelter refugees, and much more. And some religious groups definitely claim the idea of rights as an important one. Activist groups have names like Muslims for Human Rights and Hindus for Human Rights. The Catholic Church and many Protestant groups promote human rights. And of course, we can't name everyone, but pretty much every religion you can think of has some sizable group that's very vocal about the importance of human rights. So what can religion and human rights offer to each other? The answer is actually quite a few things, but we'll just focus on a couple of important things. If religion and human rights are both traditions that try to guide human well-being and our life together in this world, then human rights ideas contribute to religious traditions by their strong emphasis on equality in particular. Most religions have a deep sense of human dignity, but that can get challenged or ignored if people aren't treated like they have equal dignity. A lot of religious people and groups have taken the human rights idea that people really should have equal power and agency and have reinterpreted their traditions to express that idea better. Religion, on the other hand, offers to human rights a sense of the connections between rights and obligations, and a way of grounding human rights in living and breathing communities. Religious traditions often focus on our obligations to others. Human rights ideas don't ignore that, but human rights benefits from dialogue with traditions that have really delved deeply into questions of what people owe each other and how they can fulfill obligations of love, mercy, connection, hospitality, and more. And then human rights advocates also benefit from working with religious communities and leaders who are right there on the ground. For many people, their religious group is the one they're most connected to, and religious leaders often have the trust of their communities in ways that outsiders don't. So it enhances the cause of human rights if advocates talk to religious communities, try to figure out points of agreement, and find ways to work together to deliver services or cooperate on advocacy. So what's the future of religion and human rights? My hope would be that we don't see either religion or human rights ideas as being perfect or above critique, but instead they can actually hold each other to their own best ideals and together make their impact more powerful. Human rights can provide a legal framework for enhancing human well-being, which can be helpful, but it can also be restrictive. Human rights also has never fully shaken the criticism that it represents only one point of view, but tries to dress its ideas up as universal. Dialogue between religion and human rights is at least one way to try to work through that problem. In particular, I think that the future of the conversation relies heavily on the participation and recognition of Indigenous communities and their religious practices. Many Indigenous groups have already changed the way the global community thinks about human rights by emphasizing their connections to land and its resources. For instance, a river in New Zealand has been designated as a legally protected entity because it's considered an ancestor to one particular Indigenous Maori group. And wild rice has been recognized as a legal bearer of rights by a Native American group. As human well-being becomes increasingly dependent on whether we reverse damage to the earth and our environment, and while communities try to figure out how to challenge cultural imperialism while recognizing the value of human rights ideas, Indigenous religious thought has been neglected for too long, but it's perhaps the most important set of voices to listen to going forward.
Thanks, everyone. Angela's going to take it from here with the chat, and I'll pay attention to it as well. We'll have a minute for everyone to kind of ponder and see what questions you might have. And then I have a question or two for the group as well, if we want to go in that direction.
Okay, I'm looking for questions here. Sorry, a lot about the video. But you know, I don't see questions around, but maybe I have a question. You had talked about
Angela, you're a bit your computer's a bit scratchy. There may be something about the way that the sound went through with the video you initially shared.
Oh, okay. Let me. Think we should be good. I'll get that out of the way. We do have a question. Because religion is more abstract, is it shaped by the followers in it, or do the practices remain the same from the people who first follow it?
Oh, that's a good question. I almost wish we could have some discussion on this. I mean, it's the answer probably has to be both, and that people are shaped by the practices and traditions within the communities that they're part of, again, whether they grew up in them or whether they came to them later. And also that people right now are engaging in practices that kind of reimagine and rethink. It's sort of like any set of cultural practices, I guess. You have texts, you have traditions, you have stories that get passed down. And so that has to make a difference. But when we're talking about different traditions. I mean, we're talking about people who are living right now, and they're living kind of in the history of those traditions, but living now. So it sounds like a weasel answer, but it's not really meant to be. It's just that I think that relationship between people who are practicing right now and the traditions that they're upholding is always such an intersected relationship that you can't really tease them apart. Just for interest's sake, my religion and human rights class right now is studying about Indigenous groups and human rights. And one thing that Indigenous groups and representatives have also made a point of is that with Indigenous groups in particular, there can sometimes be a tendency from people outside of those groups to think of those groups as somehow like more past than other groups, like, oh, these traditions from time immemorial. And so not that the past is a bad thing or that people shouldn't sort of look to the past and draw on narratives and stories and teachings from past practitioners, from ancestors. But there sometimes can be a bit of a problem with assuming that sort of like, oh, well, these groups are from time immemorial and they're sort of buried in this murky past. It shows a little bit of a bias about how we kind of think about different groups, and maybe in some ways an inability to focus on that now, or to realize that there are kind of people out here right now. So that's just kind of an example of the way some of those tensions can sort of come out around the past and the present in relation to that question.
Thank you. Let's see, I have another question here from Maria. How can we reconcile the divisive and often discrimination people face through religion with the core values of faith, charity, and love that are central to many religions?
Yeah, I mean, that too is sort of a question or the question, right? We could have a whole class on it, a whole lifetime. I guess one thing to say, I'll say the part that might sound a little bit more controversial first, but it relates to the talk, is that when we talk about, let's say, something like gender or sexual orientation, religious traditions, I mean, there is stuff in the teachings of multiple religious traditions that is, in human rights terms, discriminatory. So you kind of just have to know that it is what it is, right? Those just areas of discrimination, especially when it comes to things like gender, right, or like marriage and family issues. There are teachings in the tradition that, at least on the face of them, look like they're saying that men and women should do different things, or that women don't have as much public power and so on. So I think that's what the traditions themselves work through when they think, well, look, the tradition teaches a certain type of equality. I think I'm not off base in saying that any religious tradition teaches equality in a certain sense, even if it's something like equal dignity, where that may not come out into this form of equality that we think of when we think of human rights. But so those traditions are saying equality is taught and the dignity of all is taught. How can that best be acknowledged? And as the question said, right, faith, charity, and love, those are some of the teachings. Those particular words are especially used in Christian traditions. There are analogs in other traditions. And so I think that's what's happening with a lot of religious traditions, is that there's a lot of people who care a lot about human rights style equality. So whether they put that in terms of human rights or whether they put that in terms of kind of equality and kind of equal rights generally. And they also care about their religious traditions a lot. So they're trying to figure out how to reconcile these things and not say that you have to either have one or the other. And a lot of traditions, different groups and different traditions are doing this different ways. So again, you have to kind of dig down to the ground level. But there's certainly groups in any given religious tradition that are saying, in order to express this value of, let's say, love or dignity, we just have to reinterpret and re-understand some of those teachings that talk about differences in men and women, and try to understand kind of what they're getting at, right? Like maybe there's some kind of value there that's being expressed that can be valued without actually having different roles for men and women or something like that. So I think those are some of the ways that people within those traditions are trying to reconcile these. Actually, this next question, I can see it, Angela. So this is quite interesting. Utilizing religion to raise awareness and fight for human rights without feeling like you're forcing someone to adopt their religion. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it's probably that people have to kind of navigate this the same way they would navigate any expression of religious values in the public sphere. So this is getting into a whole nother kind of set of dialogues that I'll try not to belabor, but the question of whether religious values should be expressed in the public sphere, kind of in like public political dialogue, and whether they should be expressed as religious values. Like somebody who is Muslim, let's say, saying that God is merciful. So therefore, there are certain ways in which they think society needs to be merciful. Do they say that as in terms that are more like, well, people need to be kind to each other in order to make sure that we all get a fair share, something like that, fair shake? Or do they say, look, I'm Muslim, God is merciful, you know, those values need to be expressed within society. So that's a whole set of arguments about how people actually bring their values out into public dialogue. But I think that folks who are in religious traditions who are working on this, if they do want to kind of talk about their religious values as part of their promotion of human rights or understandings of equality, let's say, I think they would probably just put it in terms of their own values. They would say, look, this is a set of values that's important to me and it's important to my community. And therefore, I'm going to fight for this human right, or I'm going to fight for human rights in general. And I think folks just feel like if they just say that, then they're being honest about where they're coming from. They're not necessarily saying that other people can't sort of come from different places, or that other people have to adopt exactly those same values that undergird their work. But that they want to be clear about kind of where their values are coming from. I want to teach a class in interreligious dialogue, and these kinds of questions come up too a lot. How do you kind of talk about values from different places, and how do you understand overlaps between different traditions, but also not say that every tradition is just the same?
Let's see, do you see that next question?
Yeah, from Adrian.
Okay.
Of course, this is my fellow faculty member, Dr. Adrian Duran, who teaches in art history. One of these days, he and I are going to teach a course on art and religious freedom, we have decided. He's waving at. Yeah, well, it's interesting, Adrian, because I think in the academy, teaching religious studies, generally people do come at it from, or whether or not they themselves are engaged in some kind of religious tradition, they teach it more from the outside, right? Let's look at what these religious people do. So in that sense, I mean, I don't know if even that feels a little weird sometimes, but and Adrian, you know, I can see you right there. So if you want to unmute and have more of a conversation, that's fine. We're, you know, in a relatively casual spot here. But some folks teach from, you know, just okay, well, let's just understand, right? Try to describe and understand what people are doing within these religious traditions. And in some sense, I think it's probably helpful to have folks who are more and less engaged with religious traditions, because then you do get kind of different perspectives, that sort of insider outsider perspective. But this is my connection. You can't hear us very well. He's gonna go out because his connection's not great. So yeah, I actually think that, like with many things, it helps to have a diversity of people who are teaching and kind of experiencing these things in different ways. But I mean, for folks who are studying religious studies in the academy, whether you're in a religious tradition or not, I think just trying to come at it the way you would come at any cultural or social set of values and cultural or social communities. You know, you just use kind of the same methodology that you would be using for anything else. If you're studying art, you know, you study it in particular ways, and you might look at religious art, but you would still be asking similar questions about it. I think the main thing that I would like to see in public life is people be able to talk amongst themselves, sort of do interreligious dialogue, both within different religious traditions and also with folks who have no religious tradition or sort of questioning, or you know, have some kind of spiritual or religious practices but are not formally affiliated. I always think of this in terms of conversation and dialogue. You know, I don't think one person is going to have that perspective that's going to be the be all end all. And so if everyone can just keep conversing with each other and holding that dialogue, I think that's going to get us closest to having some kind of helpful, broad perspective on religion, and then in the academy on religious studies.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
The video had, at one of the slides, you had had human rights on one side and religion on the other, and you had equality under human rights. And I was just kind of thinking, about a lot of times when I'm just having kind of conversation about this, there's a conversation between equality and equity. And I was just wondering if you could, you had mentioned about a criticism of it being just one point of view. So I was just wondering if equity is where equity fits in human rights in those conversations.
So you can just stop me and correct me if you want me to get more into other like specific definitions of the words that maybe you're thinking of that I'm not. But yeah, I did do. It's a little bit of a shorthand in the video because I didn't have a lot of time. That I just used the word equality. One thing to say in terms of human rights, with what I understand to be some of the dialogue around equality and equity, is that human rights say everyone has the right to life, everyone has the right to basic education, everyone has the right to freedom from torture, things like that. So human rights ideas, kind of list out these set of rights that are in theory for everyone. Now, when I was talking about indigenous groups, actually, indigenous leaders have been really important in pushing forward some ideas within human rights, saying that, look, it's one thing to say that everybody has the right to life or the right to a decent and dignified living or something like that. It's another thing for it actually to happen. So kind of like some of the concerns about rights and equality or equity within US political discussions, also within the international human rights discussion, there's been quite a lot of discussions about whether it's important to promote group rights and to promote rights for particular groups that have a history of oppression, of being oppressed, or that have a history of, in the case of indigenous groups, land being taken, resources being extracted. And so those groups are already starting out from a point where it's very difficult to actually realize all of those rights. So it's a debate in human rights, just like it's a debate in almost any other kind of political dialogue we might think of. But there is discussion about whether it's necessary, and if so, how, to kind of recognize that different groups have different needs in order to actually be able to achieve the same set of rights.
Thank you.
I'm a little bit curious, and again, I think we've gotten to the point where folks could just unmute themselves or put something in the chat. I tend to ask my own students where you see like disagreements between religion and human rights or points of connection. And so I'm curious for folks here, I mean, maybe particularly the students, but not only, when you think about religion and human rights, do you think of a particular kind of debate within or disconnection, or are there ways that you see them connecting to each other? It can be a little awkward to unmute in such a large meeting, but again, if folks want to put it in the chat instead, Angela and I can grab it from the chat. Curtis has put up a philosophical question, which isn't that surprising. Also, my colleague, Dr. Curtis Hutt, Executive Director of the Goldstein Center, is asking me about philosophy. So he says, what about religion and human rights violations? You associated religion with transcendence. So I guess I should say claims of transcendence, or claims to be engaging with something transcendence. And Curtis asks, do claims of inspiration via transcendence by nature shut down dialogue and the idea of rights for all? And yeah, I mean, Curtis, if you want to unmute and we can just have a dialogue, that would be totally fine. But I think the answer is that yes, of course they can, right? Because if you have values or teachings or practices that come from somewhere that is transcendent to human life, then it's hard to question those. Do you want to go on, Curtis?
No, I am. You get the point of the question. There's no doubt about that. And right. I will even share my video here.
Hi.
You can see I'm on the beach on sabbatical.
Sure. Of course.
No, I find that this is a great problem. having dialogue with folks who bring arguments to bear that can't be challenged, because they say that the source of their argument, what justifies their argument, is something that, well, particularly people in religious studies can't really ask a lot of questions about, because they kind of go beyond this world. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that's a not completely solvable problem when you're talking about anything from interreligious dialogue to issues of religion and discrimination. If you can claim that your fundamentals or your values are sort of beyond question, then there's not really, can't go that much farther with that. Some people would potentially accuse human rights ideas of the same concern, that, well, where are you even getting those human rights ideas from? Are you saying there's some kind of like universal moral law that like you get to decide what that moral law is or something like that? So it could be a problem that somebody might point to with human rights as well. But I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, I think it is just the case that folks who are interested in dialogue, are probably more likely to try to find ways to, meaning really folks who seek out dialogue are probably going to try to find ways to think about the relationship between transcendent claims and values and dialogue that can be accessible to different groups. But it also may be the case that even folks in a given religious tradition may not be able to talk to each other that much, because one group is saying, no, these teachings are untouchable, and the other one is saying, no, I would in fact like to question those teachings and have dialogue about them. So it's not a great answer, because I think that's right. I mean, I think it's just one of these issues of traditions that kind of change over time. This is why I like that framing of both human rights and religion, that they're traditions and they hold on to something and they're stable. And for some folks, that's the important part. And then they also change over time. And for some folks, that's the important part. And so sometimes, as we well know, you have greater disconnect between people within a religious tradition than you do between people in different religious traditions.
Thank you. Keep going.
There's another.
Yeah.
Do you see it? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say the question: to what extent is secularity itself a religious tradition in dialogue with these other religions? Well, Dr. Hutt may want to jump back in here. I think that secularity is, in fact, something quite similar to a religious tradition. I don't think anybody can get a purely sort of more objective, quote, secular point of view. Well, partly because I think of religious traditions in terms of values. And I think you can't really have a point of view that has no values attached to it. So folks who are not formally affiliated with a religious tradition, nevertheless have a set of values and sets of practices that they find to be particularly important. And usually those folks are engaged in really wonderful ways, and sort of trying to promote equality and trying to promote the values that they hold in the public sphere. I think this is a case where Dr. Hutt and I are not in complete agreement when we talk about human rights things, but I think that secularity or secularism ought to pretty much be put alongside religious traditions and talked about in relation to them as another philosophical tradition of values. Dr. Hutt, as Goldstein Center, you want to say anything different from your perspective here?
No, I mean, I understand why people think that. I do tend to disagree. I think there are different ways that we can justify the beliefs that we hold and that we defend to other people. And I think that certain ways of justifying them are kind of inadmissible from a more of a scientific perspective, or let's say a social scientific perspective. That is troubling, though. I don't like to say that we're not going to listen to you because you're not going to defend your beliefs in a way that we can all understand, or you're not going to answer the questions that we pose to you. This is a huge challenge. I think I don't necessarily want to defend any extreme form of secularism, but I would like to defend some sort of, how can we say, common faith and reason, and providing justifications, answering questions that I think that all human beings actually on some levels can agree with. You know, if you sit down on a chair and you feel an ouch underneath you, you look, you inquire to see what it is that has caused that. It's attack, right? You sat on something you shouldn't have sat on, but you can inquire and you can see what in fact that is. And anyone who's in the room with you, you can point to the attack and you can say, see, that's why I screamed. I screamed or something. I think there are ways of there are things that we can all agree on. Religion, unfortunately, does not happen to be one of those.
Yeah, and we could have a longer conversation later maybe about whether there's something that would be called secularism as kind of a set of philosophical ideas, and whether there's something more like when we had that one discussion the other day about methods, like maybe there are methods or ways of knowing that are more universal than some that are really grounded in sort of human experience and even maybe to some extent physical experience. But I have to do a little bit more thinking about that. So the next questions I have, okay, we got to the question about the recording available. So yes, the recording itself here with the chat, with the conversation may not be available, but that recording of the actual module is already up on YouTube. And we're going to make sure there's one with good captions too. YouTube does some captions, but sometimes they're a little bit questionable. Okay, so last question that I'm seeing here is, given the past of the Catholic Church and even some current groups and ideologies, how can we approach a conversation with secular advocates who might downplay religious advocacy due to the silence of church leaders? And I presume that's having to do with the sexual abuse crisis within the Catholic Church and the way that church leaders stayed silent on a lot of issues of sexual abuse within the church. And you all are like asking the best questions with the hardest answers, because the answers often are things that would kind of happen over time, that there's kind of not one neat trick to sort of make things happen. You know, but I think that's right, that groups that have had rights violations, you know, violations of values, especially ones that are so well publicized and that went on for so long within the Catholic Church and were ignored by so many leaders. I mean, I think it's kind of on those groups to have to regroup and say, look, if people are so committed to the Catholic Church, and, you know, this could happen in some kind of non-religiously affiliated group too, but religious groups are big and they sometimes have hierarchies. I mean, there's reasons that these things can happen in religious groups and sometimes with less oversight. But I think if people remain parts of those groups, you know, it's really on them to say, how is this going to change, right? They're big organizations. They take a long time to change, like any other large organization. But I mean, I think it's reasonable for somebody, let's say you have a Catholic person who is really interested in advocacy for human rights, and they're talking to somebody who's not Catholic who's saying, well, why should I even listen to you? I mean, look at your tradition. I think that person is just going to kind of have to deal with, you know, how do I claim this tradition and the way that the tradition advocates for human rights? Because actually the Catholic Church, out of all the religious groups that we can think of, has lots of statements that are in support of human rights. You know, they have to say, well, how do I talk about that? And then say, yeah, like there's lots of big problems here. And can they, as a Catholic, also be part of advocating for oversight within the Catholic Church, for just motivations or ways of working within that institution to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen again. We have a comment from Dr. Leiden, who is just this year has joined our religious studies department, and I encourage you to take his courses in religion and film. He says, appealing to reason is a good thing, but also reason itself is culturally conditioned. Many Enlightenment thinkers who thought they were giving universal views were not in fact doing so because they mirrored the views of their society. And this is also a part of talking about human rights, and especially with indigenous groups who are pushing back against the idea that only European and only European Enlightenment ways of thinking can kind of get the world where it needs to go. So John, you know, I don't know if that's the connection you were thinking of, and I don't want to take your question too far afield, but I do think there are indigenous groups that are also saying, look, even what we think about as being like human reason, these ways of thinking about things are not quite the same for every group. Again, I don't have sort of a answer to those dialogues, except just more dialogue, that people need to be talking to each other about these things. But I think I'm with you on this, Dr. Leiden. Maybe we may join together against Dr. Height here, but
yeah, well, don't mean to attack the man on the beach, but yeah, I was interested, and I do believe in reason as a good thing, but that's kind of what I was fishing for in my original question.
I do think that question of whether there are some ways of knowing that are relatively commonly shared is a really interesting one, but it's not one I've done a lot of philosophical work on myself, so I have to think about it a bit.
Yeah, well, here comes Curtis again. But so, yeah, I think, there's two sides to this, but I know that in some of these debates about human rights, that people will say, well, wait a minute, there isn't a universal perspective here. And even some religious groups objected to the UN statement saying, hey, this is a very culturally conditioned statement. And so that there are battles about the interpretation of those things for that reason.
I only wanted to add one thing to consider, and something I have thought a lot about, because my wife is a neuroscientist, and I have to tell you that when she's engaged in inquiries or investigations and experiments, she collaborates with people in China and people in India and people around the world, and they don't have any problem, when it comes to determining whether a certain experiment was performed correctly or incorrectly, or looking for, they have all sorts of ways that they can put checks and double blinds on what they're doing, and they can actually come to consensus across the globe. Why is it religious folks can't come to consensus across the globe?
Well, I guess it doesn't subject itself to the scientific method as easily with hypothesis testing. I mean, maybe what works is what's ethical, but it's hard to even determine what that is sometimes.
He muted, and then Curtis, you went back on mute.
He can't hear you. Unmute.
I heard you. No, I just question the degree to which the study of religion as a human phenomenon is all that different from the study of other human phenomena.
Yeah. So I've got a couple more. One question that you may not all be able to see was about ethical humanists and Unitarians, so folks who don't claim. I think this is really interesting, and again, we could have a longer conversation about what it means to claim a connection to something transcendent. Here, I don't think transcendent only means something like a God or the spirits of the ancestors or something like that. That you could be claiming a connection to almost like the network of human society or something like that. I've heard Unitarians talk about the web of existence and the web of connection. And I think for the purposes of what I'm talking about here, that would be something that kind of goes beyond any individual human being or any individual, even human society. So in that sense, I see groups like ethical humanists or Unitarians or atheist and agnostic groups that are working together on kind of philosophical discussions and talking about values. I think those groups, I wouldn't want to impose a label of religion on those groups if it's a label that they don't want, but I do think that kind of tradition of dialogue around teachings and values often looks a lot like what religious traditions are doing. And so even if it's not all exactly the same, I think there's a lot of points of possible dialogue there between the different groups. So I think that's what I'll say about that. And then we also have a question about Christian mission trips and religious and cultural erasure. Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is where a lot of indigenous groups are really pushing back on the way that human rights have been kind of promoted as an international set of values, but maybe without always looking into history of how values have been imposed upon some groups by other groups. I don't think I have a one yes or no answer to if we were asked directly, should mission trips happen? That's a big question. There's a lot of different kinds of mission trips. That's most common within the Christian tradition, although you could argue that maybe in some other traditions there's something that's kind of, there might be things that are a little bit similar. But there are a lot of different types of what people call mission trips. And so this actually, without actually being able to go into the full debate, gets to some issues of religious freedom as a human right, because the Christian religious tradition in particular, not completely alone, but in particular, does teach that people should go out and try to convert others to that tradition. Now, again, within the tradition, there's people who say you should do that. There's people who say you shouldn't. There are different ways of interpreting that teaching, but it is a historical teaching within the tradition. And so if you told Christians that they were not allowed to go out and tell people they should join the Christian tradition, you might arguably be infringing upon their religious liberty. On the other hand, a lot of mission work that has gone on, and even in some sense, kind of current right now, thinking back to how current events are related to history, a lot of that has been done in conjunction with actions, namely colonialism, that have significantly violated people's rights, including their religious freedom, as well as other sorts of human rights. And so I just also think that that's a dialogue that has to keep going. It's a case where just simply saying that people are well-meaning right now doesn't erase the history of colonialism. On the other hand, dialogue between different religious traditions, there are traditions that say, you should talk about how amazing this religion is and why other people should sort of agree with you and should actually join the tradition. So that's that and gender, I think, might really be the two difficulties that people run into when they're thinking about human rights and religion. And I think that's another one where more and more dialogue and sort of critique is needed. From a human rights standpoint, I would say that the idea that one tradition or culture is superior to another is a really suspect idea. So the idea of equal dignity and equal rights, I think it's very difficult to reconcile that with an idea that some particular cultural or religious perspective would be superior without qualification, but really superior at all. And so if we're just thinking from a human rights perspective, I think that there would be a strong push to push back against an idea of religious or cultural superiority. So what do you think, Angela? We promised everybody an hour, and I don't see another question in here unless you have one. So we might be able to do an amazing thing and actually wrap up like right on the hour.
I think we got all of the questions. I don't see any more.
Okay. Yeah, great. Well, I appreciate it, everybody. Thank you. This is kind of a trial run for these modules, and just also seeing how they might be able to provoke some dialogue. So we really appreciate your being here and your questions. Like I said, we'll get some decent captions up on that, but the YouTube link is in the chat, and feel free to write to me, write to Dr. Hutt, write to Ms. Brown, go to the Goldstein Center website. We want you to know where this stuff is available, so we'll be happy to answer questions if you have them.